change is dictating, if you actually do the science and look at that story, is that we need to store more CO2 into the soil as humus. And as you'll come to understand as we run through this program, humus, the whole building of humus is a biological process. There's no other way you can do it. And it's not hard to sort of recognise from looking at something from the outside as a business that as it becomes increasingly recognised that putting the humus in the soil, or storing the humus, understand there's only ever been the same number of carbon molecules on the planet that were there from day one. They're stored in the soil, they're stored in the biomass, or they're stored in the atmosphere. And a great deal of what was in the soil is now in the atmosphere. And the sums, just so you know, just so you understand that, we've gone from 5% down to 1.5% humus in the soil. So we lost 2/3 of our humus. If you look at what that represents in terms of CO2, since 1860, the height of the Industrial Revolution, 470 gigatons is now in the atmosphere as CO2 that was in the soil as humus. During that same time, all of mankind's activities, 6 billion lungs breathing out CO2, the motor vehicles spewing it out, the coal-fired power stations, industry, the whole shooting box, 270 gigatons. It's almost double the amount that came from the soil, remembering there's always only the same number of molecules that are cycling between the soil, the biomass, the plants, and the atmosphere. We really need desperately to intervene, and that's what biological agriculture is about, and in that carbon cycle and grab it and store it as humus. And to do that, you've got a whole group of organisms that fix humus in the soil. And when we do the soil life analysis, those organisms aren't there. And they become, when you actually recognise the importance of this thing, they become the most important creatures on the planet at this point in time. And you can see very easily that at some point there'll be legislation. Anyone can foresee that potential, protecting those creatures that will save the day, because they're actually the only ones that can save the day. Without being too grim on this front, we've currently been pushing the idea of cutting emissions. Well, what happens if you cut emissions by 100% tomorrow? The entire world says, yep, we're in huge trouble, we're stopping all CO2 emissions. Never going to happen, but if it did, what happens? Well, in 200 years' time, we're down to the CO2 levels we had in the soils in 1975, which is way too high. The oceans continue to acidify, the oceans continue to heat. We haven't got 200 years. That is the bottom line. That's 100%. That's not the 5, 10% over 20 years we're talking about. The only way that we can actually intervene in this thing and make any difference is to build humus as fast and as efficiently as we possibly can, and composting and all the things Ron talked about are part of that equation, and hold that humus in the soil and keep it out of the atmosphere and intervene in the carbon cycle. And what does that mean? Well, if you take the Americans currently, they spew out 8 billion of the 30 billion tonnes of CO2 that go out there every year. 8 billion comes from just 5% of the world's population, and you could be fairly aggrieved if you lived in a third world country with no carbon footprint and you were in drought because of that 8 billion tonnes. But if we take 1%, build 1% humus in the cultivated, and only the cultivated lands in the US, that pulls back 4.5 billion of the 8 billion tonnes, and that's more than what we need to do. That's why you need to be paid carbon credits yesterday, and that's hopefully we'll see something in light of that coming shortly. So now that we started looking